I want to obviously get some, relevant football stuff and talking about Chelsea and what's going on at the moment. You wrote a really interesting piece, and part of your newsletter recently was speaking about the midfield, which I think is such a key area for Chelsea, and it's been something that has fluctuated a lot over the last few years because it has been very uncertain. That probably the most uncertain period of the most uncertain space in Chelsea's sort of pitch, to be honest, and our formation, and where does it, the balance issue and who should be in that midfield, what type of midfield should it be, who are we trying to pursue in the transfer market. And you were sort of going into, elaborating on Chelsea's sort of midfield composition and space, and how, in your opinion, we don't currently use it well in possession or look comfortable operating in space out of possession. And you were sort of talking about Jorginho, Kovacic, Kante, who's predominantly been used, of course, under Thomas Tuchel so far. I just sort of want to gauge sort of and explore that idea, because I think, personally for me, who's been someone who's been quite critical of that midfield area and not really thinking there's been a perfect solution, I've been quite pleasantly surprised how Tuchel's found a way around that problem.
Yeah, this is probably one of the most interesting concepts to me, because I think, I don't know if I've been sort of like a front runner, or it's just the area that I focus on most. So I used to play in midfield, like it's the area that I kind of gravitate towards. I have often felt that we never really replaced Nemanja Matic when we sold him in terms of that profile of holding midfield. And I think one of the sort of the kind of tenets or the sort of principles that I think when I look at Premier League teams and I look at teams that win titles is they always kind of have either a really top tier holding player or like a really aggressive like ball winner. They have someone in midfield who's like physical and wins the ball and is kind of like the reference point for the rest of the team. Look at City this season. I think Rodri has been like a revelation there. Tall, physical guy, not the most athletic, but he's the reference point. Very good defensively, covers the back four really well. For example, historically, you go through Chelsea's teams: Makelele, Essien, Mikel, Matic. Man United have had Roy Keane. I think Michael Carrick's been a really good example of a top class holding player. Arsenal, when Arsenal were good, had Patrick Vieira. They've never ever replaced Patrick Vieira in the 20 odd years or whatever since he's gone. Liverpool bringing Fabinho and obviously Wijnaldum and Henderson are both very physical, but he kind of knitted it together. Fernandinho at City. I could sort of go on with this sort of theory. And I think certainly kind of looking at the midfield composition that Chelsea have had, probably, it's been really, I think, really difficult to find balance. And I think when you look at sort of let's say the last kind of season of Kante towards probably under Lampard's kind of stewardship, the way that we use midfield players, I think, has kind of shifted kind of almost each season. Sarri, I think we played a very controlled possession style of game with sort of the three players in midfield, but we were still trying to be quite offensive at times. And I think when you look at Sarri's team and potentially when it was undone, physically outmatched by a lot of teams, and I think teams kind of after maybe the first couple of games, 10, 15 games where Jorginho looked like the best player in the world, when they kind of realised, well, hang on a minute, let's just kick him and see what happens. Then sort of the team kind of dissipated, and then Kante and Kova and whoever else was in that sort of midfield trio at the time, we kind of got, I think, overrun there. And I think teams sort of realised that they could swarm us, and that was sort of the method of dealing with us. Lampard, I think, kind of took that in a different direction. He wanted to be a lot more aggressive, wanted to be a lot more attack-minded, a lot more offensively minded. Again, Lampard's kind of undoing really was that he never really was able to balance the way that we kind of dealt in terms of defensive transitions. So if you remember, the amount of times we'd see counter-attacks where we'd lose the ball and then it would literally be Jorginho and two centre-backs trying to defend the counter-attack from like 3 or 4 people. So he never really kind of got to grips with that concept. And yes, obviously, we probably score a lot more goals under Lampard than we do under Thomas Tuchel, but that is kind of by design because we had like 25 men forward and just, Jorginho and the 2 centre-backs behind him. So I think what Tuchel has done when he's sort of come into Chelsea, he's me probably one of the most intelligent football coaches out there in terms of the way that he approaches and analyses the game. I think that he has looked at sort of the successful components under Sarri in terms of defending with the ball, in terms of ball retention. And I think he sort of looked at the way that the team was kind of unfolding under Frank Lampard. And what he's done here, I think, is incredibly smart. He's just made the team incredibly compact. Now, this to me, when you look at the system, and I think the system for me is the main beneficiaries of the 2 midfield players, because they have 3 centre-backs behind them by design, by sort of the natural function of playing 3 at the back. Our wing-backs play almost like wide midfielders at times. They are there to kind of defend the wide channels. They do a lot of the defensive work in those kind of outer channels. Reece James and Alonso and Chilwell, for example, almost make it at times defensively like a flat midfield 4. And what that I think has done is allowed the two pivot players, whether it's Kante, Georgie, or Kova, to defend basically a less area of the pitch. So under Lampard, Jorginho had to cover touchline to touchline and had like a lot of kind of vertical space to cover as well. Now, where you've kind of got that four in midfield at times, the thing that really sets it apart is the fact that you've got Mason Mount ahead of them and his work rate, his ability to press, his ability to what playing Mount does. It means that Jorginho and Kova don't have to push up and engage people in midfield. And that's the first point really when we start talking about the utilisation of space. When you saw Jorginho and Kova, I don't want to say at their worst, but when teams kind of figured out them defensively, you wanted to draw them in possession. And I remember reading an article about a coach at Manchester City delivered a seminar in Madrid. I remember seeing the video clip. And they were talking specifically about how City played Chelsea. And then they said, well, we know that Jorginho likes to jump up. He likes to press. So our entire game model, our entire game plan was to basically almost bait him to come out of possession. And then they showed a clip. I think it might have been either the cup final or a cup semi-final. They played a couple of passes and they scored just by pulling Jorginho out of possession. So when I talk about us sort of not being good in space from a defensive perspective, what I mean by that is, I don't want to poke fun at him. I know it's something that I personally find amusing sometimes when Georgie gets done one-on-one in space. Yes, I know people will say that's horrible, but that's just how I am. But him and Kova to an extent, when you can play them one-on-one, when you can bring them out into space, you can play, I think, very quickly around them. And I think what we've seen is that both of them struggle to get back. So what Tuchel's done in terms of compacting the team, they don't have to kind of press vertically anymore. They can stay in their kind of line of defence, and they can only sort of press when the ball comes towards them rather than having to chase the game. So when we're looking at sort of, defensively in space, what I mean by certainly in the midfield areas is that we don't really have players who are comfortable going out to people and making challenges. Declan Rice can press out, can win a tackle, and then can start a counter-attack, for example. If we flip that and look at sort of someone like Kante, for example, who's very good at that sort of thing, very good at pressing and winning the ball, his kind of deficiencies come then when he wins the ball and now he's in space. We've seen him play, some really fantastic driving runs of late, but then that final pass just isn't there. It's a little sideways pass to Reece James. It's a little safe pass to one of the forwards. Once you've won the ball and driven into a really dangerous area, you would hope that somebody could pick out a slightly more aggressive or slightly more dangerous pass. So where maybe Kova and Jorginho may be slightly better at playing that pass, they're maybe not in the areas that Kante are in because they don't have the athleticism of Kante and they don't win the ball in space. So you kind of have this sort of yin and yang situation where the strengths of Kante are probably the weaknesses of the others and, vice versa. And then this is kind of, I suppose, where it gets into sort of feeding into the rest of the team. So the fact that we have, I think, a midfield that I think is very functional in terms of the setup, but it requires so much from the rest of the team that I think that when you look at Chelsea's lack of kind of real clinical edge or cutting edge in the final third, I think a lot of it comes from the fact that we have to play so safely in midfield. We don't want to encourage players to play into space or move into space. When we win the ball, we almost kind of adopt this sort of Pep kind of protocol of, he wants to play 15 passes to like reset the game so that he can then start building attacks. That's one of his kind of fundamental things. When we win possession quickly, maybe you want someone in midfield who can play or at least try to play Timo Werner in quickly, for example, get him quickly into the game. But instead, it's this kind of very safe, kind of passive possession, retain the ball, get into shape. Tuchel, calls it defending with the ball. He wants the players to be in sort of the kind of positions that he wants them to move into effectively. So in terms of sort of the space side of things, I think the concept that I was sort of looking at in the newsletter was really that from a defensive perspective, we have to be incredibly compact, which then kind of, most football games are kind of won in that transition state. So when you win the ball and then, things are slightly out of sync, other teams, the defensive team are not in shape, etc., you can take advantage of that. When we win the ball, because of the style of play and maybe the players we have, we want to kind of retain possession and be quite stagnant almost. I think that's why when we play teams that aren't very ambitious, that it can look like the Southampton game. It can look very laboured. We can look laboured in trying to break teams down. And then it's kind of, the sort of spacing as well, as I say, in terms of sort of offensively being with the ball. It's tricky, I think, for some of these players to use the kind of pockets of space that we do create. So, for, one of the Timo Werner is a very, very good example here. When we do win the ball quickly, there is space in behind, and that space is very, very. It's there for like a fraction of a second that you can play that pass and get Timo Werner in. But the fact that we want to retain possession, we want to kind of mix it up in midfield, we want to keep the ball, we want to make it nice and neat, recycle it, make sure everyone gets into position. You kind of question a little bit in terms of how that impacts the attack. And then kind of the last thing really is when you look at sort of the way that Chelsea attack. I'm a fan of getting at least one, if you're playing three midfielders and then two, but if you're playing with two, at least one midfielder to sort of join the attack there. I question whether, and I don't think this is kind of Tuchel's end game here, but the amount of shots that we've had from Jorginho, Kovacic and Kante from like 20, 30 yards this season under Tuchel's increased quite a bit, because that cutback that he likes to play to the edge of the area, that's kind of where those midfielders are going to be sitting. So while they probably have maybe one of them a season that goes into the top corner, you might think that somebody like a Frank Lampard might be a little bit more in tune in terms of finishing that kind of chance. And I think that sort of that composition of real, I just think that they lack a lot kind of in the final third in terms of any combination of the midfielders that you want to pick, whether that is the ability to shoot decently well on a consistent basis, whether that is to find a telling pass, whether that is to move the ball kind of at pace. So, the lack of tempo, I think, that comes from the midfield play, that comes from this sort of very short passing game, I think inhibits the way that we attack. I think by the time we progress the ball to the final third, the space that we had is now completely compact. Teams play a back four, back five, etc. And then you're looking at sort of the midfield in terms of their passing quality, and you're asking the team really, does Jorginho, Kovacic or Kante have that final ball in the locker regularly? I think Kova played an insane pass earlier in the season. I think I can't remember who you're playing against, but we won a penalty from this ridiculous through ball. But that was also from quite deep in the pitch. So you're looking at final third. By the time we get there, the pace we get there, the fact that we've now compressed the space in their half rather than our own half again, I think then sort of generates the second layer of problems that we have, which is, I know we've spoken about on Nini's channel, but the lack of ability in terms of having the final pass, the final bit of vision, the final bit of quality. And there's been a number of games this season where we've kind of been just very passively moving the ball left to right and probing, and nobody's really wanted to take advantage of that. So, the whole concept, I think, really kind of stems from, as you say, sort of the midfield composition. And generally, I think just how, I think going forward, Tuchel will probably want a slightly different profile of play in there, either to increase the tempo, the range of the midfield, i.e. the ability to go and hunt the ball and then actually get back in if they miss it, ability to sort of be a bit more aggressive in terms of defensive possession. And the thing is as well, I mean, when we're kind of looking at space going forward, if you want to be a little bit more on the front foot, if you want to be a bit more aggressive, a bit more expansive, we're going to have to open up some of this this sort of space between the lines. You're going to want Timo to play higher. You're going to want players to play further beyond the lines of a holding midfielder, or be a little bit more aggressive in terms of their positioning. And then when you open up the space, and that's when you go back to maybe some of the problems that Lampard saw, that Maurizio Sarri saw. So there's a really fine balance between sort of using space well and then getting a little bit extreme to the point where we're getting caught on counters and stuff like that. But my hope and my belief is that if you maybe change the profile of midfielders in that pivot, or in general, that the ability to want to play with risk and want to play on the front foot, be more expansive, you can do that because you've maybe got better athletes in there, or maybe players who are better defensively, etc.
I think, in terms of that midfield, I think there has been some people who've tried to sell what Tuchel has done as like, he's just fixed everything, and look, like Jorginho and Kovacic, they're just like wonderful, faultless midfielders. And there was, what the hell was going on before then? I'm very simple, someone who has defended Jorginho over I don't think he's a useless player. I think in the right system, he can be utilised, preferably a system that wants a lot of the ball. Both Kova and Georgie can do a decent, competent job in that, and sometimes a better than competent job. We've seen some really good performances from those two, and I think it's a little bit disingenuous sometimes when I think people haven't given those players credit, when I think they actually have had some really good performances, big performances. As much as people, we'll talk about Liverpool at the moment, I think the performance Jorginho had at a ground like Anfield, where you feel like especially against one of the best pressing sides in the Premier League for like the last 5 years, that's like a place where you feel he's going to be exploited most. And he struggled against Liverpool before. Liverpool have really targeted Jorginho in recent years and succeeded because of that. And I thought we had a really good game that night. But I was fascinated when I wrote a piece about Jorginho recently. It's one of those things where you think of instinct, because I was looking at a lot of like the heat maps recently for Jorginho of where he was positioned. And it's so funny because sometimes when you look at a heat map or an average position, it's different to the formation set out at the start of a game. Jorginho is almost where you would look at him in a formation now under Tuchel. He is not pressing up the pitch at all. Like I remember looking at his last game under Lampard, I think it was the Fulham game in January, all over the pitch, being asked at times to press up. under Tuchel most of the time, if you look at majority of his heat map, he is in one position and he ain't moving out that position. And I was speaking to Dan McCarthy about this, and he brought this up instantly. Like, because of that mobility issue that you've brought up, he's not pressing up. He doesn't really have to. There's space around him. Sometimes you'll see Reece tuck in, or whether Callum's in there as well. He's got players around him that's helping him. But moving into next season, and the point you make about sort of risk taking and style of play, I think it's really effective at the moment. Partly because Tuchel's being very pragmatic with the squad he has, that he hasn't been able to bring in any of his own players, but also I think because of the nature of this season, it's very congested. There's probably a load of players feeling fatigued at the moment. You can't be as expressive as maybe you want to. It's maybe a more reactive season, and even though Chelsea have a lot of the ball, and I think he's been very smart in a short period of time to instill those ideas. I just think that next season, I don't know if you agree with this, I see the Premier League now, and I just don't think even Kante or Mourinho style of play, where you are a little bit more... This team isn't... I think I'd be silly to call this team like those teams in terms of being reactive, because this team wants a lot of the ball. It wants to control the game in possession a lot more than Jose or Conte did, right? But I don't think this style of play that we currently have is going to win us a Premier League title. I think it will competently get us into the top four. Maybe could get us second if someone like City or Liverpool blast the league again. Maybe where Man United are right now. We could have a decent season. I don't think this current style is where Tuchel sees this team, and I think it'd be a waste of the attacking talent if you have to. Because it does feel like to me, and Lampard struggled with this as well, is when you change, say you go from Kante as that lone DM in a 4-3-3 to Jorginho as a lone DM, you're basically changing the whole composition of your midfield and the way it has to work. And I felt sorry for Jorginho at times, because it was quite clear to me that he was being asked to do things that just his attribute, like his style of play, the way he is as a player, was just incapable of doing. You need a more mobile DM in that situation.
Yeah.
So it's been difficult, and I guess we could sort of move on to the summer, because to me, I've been banging this drum. I know you have as well. It's kind of quite concerning to me when I'm hearing reports about a striker and a centre back and even a goalkeeper, and I'm like, there's this glaring area of the pitch that Chelsea haven't invested in for so long. It's the one big hole for me in the pitch that would open up so many more avenues if we get it right. Personally, I don't know about that in terms of where do we go in terms of recruitment.
Yeah, I think I completely concur on that. And I think the point about certainly the style not being one that's conducive to winning a league title, I completely agree on that. You look at certainly the way that we're playing at the moment, and you can delve into how much you want to sort of give weight to XG and stuff like that, but we generally don't create, or we might create one chance of 0.3 and above, so like a 30% chance of scoring. That 30% figure is roughly what people consider to be like the low end of like a good chance. So we're creating like probably one of those a game to win matches. So a lot of it is on kind of individual brilliance. So to put it into context, I think Mount's goal against Liverpool was like 0.15 or something, and I think Timo Werner had like one chance, which was really good, that he maybe could have finished. City are producing, I think, on average between 4 and 5 of these a game. So when you're kind of looking at, and they probably have better finishers in some capacity in terms of the guys that are on the end of those chances. The style of play at the moment, I think, isn't really going to kind of, it's not going to produce the amount of chances that we probably need to consistently win, a Premier League title. 38 games, you have to probably say that we're probably not going to win every single one of those 1-0. It would be amazing if we did.
When it's also fine margins, isn't it? Like it's those moments in any title team, any team that's won a Premier League title. You look at Chelsea, you look at City. At points in a season, sometimes when you don't expect to, you're challenged and you have to take risks. Jose's team took risks. You could argue the start of that the 14-15 season in particular, that 6-3 against Everton, where Chelsea were very much for the first half of that season were a lot more offensive. At some point, for me at the moment with Chelsea, it's too, I don't know if the right phrase is fine margins, but we have to be very clinical of our opportunities. And this has not been
incredibly well,
and this has not been a team that's been blessed with clinical finishes.
Yeah. See, and that point is super interesting, because I think at times the way that we have to create chances, it almost has to be the perfect piece of play for us to get a good scoring opportunity. And it's either that, or as I say, you look at the Atletico away game, we had so much territory in that game. We were camped in their half at, one of the best defensive sides in Europe, and yet we still needed an overhead kick. which spent 35 minutes being reviewed by VAR to decide the game. And those are kind of I think the fine margins, that the level of difference between what's a good result and a bad result. I mean, Southampton, one momentary lapse between, I don't know what, probably Christensen and Zoom. I can't remember who the centre backs were. One pass goes in, bang, they score a goal. And really, for the rest of the games we've played under Tuchel, that kind of chance just hasn't been there. So I think, sort of returning to sort of the midfield kind of component. I think that the one word that I use, and I certainly use when I look at midfielders and scout them and kind of sort of look at them in terms of analysing them, the word I use is multifunctional. And by that I mean guys who can defend, who get the physical side of the games, who are good athletes, but beyond sort of just being athletic and powerful and all the sort of things you would want in a Premier League player, you want guys who can pass, who have got the ability to carry the ball through midfield. Maybe they've got a good shot on them, for example. A little bit of creativity and individuality in the final third. I know we're sort of looking potentially, Declan Rice is still very much on the table. You're looking at Aurélien and Tchouaméni, for example, the guy that I really like at Monaco. But somebody like that, or that kind of profile of player, I think really transforms the team in general. You're looking at potentially having somebody who can play those aggressive passes, can actually increase the tempo of how we play, can win aggressive one-on-one battles in midfield, can be left a little bit to their own devices defensively. And I think this is the one thing when I certainly look at the midfield at the moment, the ability to actually trust that your midfield don't necessarily need Reece James tucking in or Ben Chilwell tucking in, or maybe Rudiger's kind of, anticipating that something's going to happen. If you can kind of give them their space and let them defend a bigger quadrant, you all of a sudden you can push your wing backs further forward. Timo Werner can play on the shoulder more. Kai Havertz can take more aggressive positions with the ball. Maybe your back three are not having to defend the width of the penalty area. Maybe, Rudiger is effectively playing as like an auxiliary left back in possession because he's confident that, if we do lose the ball, then, Tchouaméni or Rice or whoever can actually come back in and cover those spaces. So from sort of a development standpoint, the midfield area for me is probably the most important area to play because it's the way that you inject the tempo into the team. It's a way that I think you can almost instantly change the kind of mentality of the team to be slightly more attacking, a bit more offensive minded. There are times when, Jorginho or Kovacic or Kante have the ball and you can see that there is an aggressive pass. It is a risky pass to make, but there are players who can play those passes. And the thing is as well, when you have players who can play those passes and the opposition know that, again, that changes how they defend you. I think sometimes when we play teams, particularly in midfield, teams are quite happy for us to have the ball because they know that real kind of incisive line-breaking pass or the ability to dribble and beat people and then play that pass and to actually have that end product doesn't always exist. Yes, obviously we have moments where all three of those guys can do something in a game, but we're talking about consistently. And I think sometimes, again, when you look at certainly, the Southampton game, the Man United game, for example, where it was kind of a stalemate, I think sometimes you need to have that little bit of injection in midfield to be able to kind of set the tempo of the games. And doesn't have to be Frank Lampard shooting from 30 yards. It can be Michael Essien, that kind of level of dynamism, but the ability to then play a pass as well on top of that.
Yeah, we spent so much money on so many exciting attacking players in last summer. I mean, I remember, I look silly now. I mean, I made videos with so many people. Nini, I think me and him made quite a few videos, like lauding and being so excited about the fact that we could see like the best Chelsea attacking side since Ancelotti. And this is not a criticism of Tuchel. I think he's been very intelligent from what he's found, and he's got some brilliant results. And I don't think any Chelsea fan should be moaning about that. But when we move on to next season, it's like, why did we spend? I mean, we could even be spending even more on some attack, 150 million. We could be spending more than we spent on like 3 players on one player. And I don't know, I did, people got a little bit annoyed at me because I said, I don't know what that says about your ability to recruit players. But it's, to me, I don't feel like, I don't think Chelsea, it's not even about being, aesthetic or playing football the right way. For me, I just look at what's working. And what's working right now is not Jose Mourinho sitting back waiting for things to happen, and hoping the other team. Because as well, teams are a lot better on the ball than they were, especially multiple teams in the Premier League for me are a lot better in possession than they were 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. So I think the game, you have to take risks. And I think there were elements earlier in the season pre-Tuchel where I was like, I can see what Frank's trying to do, especially when you've got someone like Reece James. And as you point out, Reece James' responsibility now, we're not really attacking down the right as much anymore. No. We're more attacking down the left. And Reece's ability with a cross is so good. I don't know why any coach wouldn't want to try and exploit that. You know, Hakim Ziyech as well. And you could sort of see, as you know, and it comes back to the midfield, isn't it? You know, you could see those elements that Frank was trying to build earlier in the season in an attacking sense, trying to use width, trying to cut in from the right. You've got two of the best crosses in Ziyech and James, and you're trying to feed attackers on the left like Timo Werner, and it was starting to click a little bit. But then it comes back to that midfield where there's risks, isn't there? And I agree with you. I think it needs to be prioritised. I'm sure we've had this conversation as well about Declan and whether it can happen. I've sort of, even though on Twitter I'm still, trying to hype him up, I've sort of accepted defeat, I think, because I think that the evaluation on him will be too high. I also can't help but feel all the stuff we heard, and it could be wrong, but all the stuff we heard, because Rice was such a big part, his name was loomed over Lampard's departure in terms of being such a key reason why there could have been a falling out. It wasn't the only reason, but the fact his name kept on cropping up, I think, was an interesting aspect to me. And you bring up Tchouaméni, even another name I've been talking about recently, Kessie at AC Milan. Sort of that profile of player that I do find quite interesting. Tchouaméni's an interesting one, and I just want to touch on this quickly because his history as a player is quite fascinating to me, because I think I've been sort of dreaming of this hybrid between Jorginho and Kante. If we could bring in someone into a team, if it's even possible, someone who has the mobility to be a defensive midfielder, someone to break up play. You can play more risky passes. You can be a bit more offensive and have to trust there's someone there to cover that space behind, but also has a passing range to them in a team that wants a lot more of the ball. And I just wonder, he's a very young player. We don't Tim way back, and I know it's very easy. I'm trying not to be lazy here and say Bakayoko failed because he was a Monaco midfielder and came in, because I think there is a talented player within there in Bakayoko, and I think he's done well since. But there is a lot of maybe risk in that deal, but actually, it's not a high profile deal. Probably it's not going to cost the club as much as Declan will. So could you see that as a viable option to sort of solve this problem?
I think so. Yeah. He's someone that I think. I watch an awful lot of French football and have done for a number of years, and watching him kind of have come through the ranks at sort of Bordeaux and then moving to Monaco. I think the reason that I would have a lot of faith in him coming to the Premier League and probably doing well is that I think he's probably got a range to his performances that I think maybe set himself apart from quite a few other players. And by range, what I mean is if you go and watch, let's say, both of Monaco's games against PSG this season, you'll see an incredibly aggressive, ball-winning, defensively minded performance. And yet in that game, he still had a couple of moments of real passing quality. One of them for a goal, which was one of the best passes from midfield I've seen that set up a chance for Cesc Fabregas to score. And then if you watch them play more on the front foot, like recently they played against Marseille, I think he was man of the match in that game. I think he scored, might have been the goal that was in the rounds on Twitter, for example, recently. You're seeing a player that's super aggressive, front foot on the ball, carrying the ball through midfield, trying to play all these sort of crazy passes and really trying to be the driving force of the team. I think that seeing a guy be able to have the discipline to play a PSG when they've got all these wonderful players and still look like the best player on the pitch, and then sort of flip the switch and then become the focal point of the attack with his passing and his ability to drive and to score and to create this sort of wonderful kind of combination of skills. And then obviously he's got all the physical tools. I mean, you just watch him play, his ability to win tackles from weird angles, his recovery speed, his aggression, his physicality, his size, all of the stuff that you would want in that position. So I do think potentially that he is a viable alternative to Declan. I mean, you're looking at arguably, maybe half price if Declan is being valued at, I know David Moyes said £100 million, but I mean, Rice is probably going to go between, 70 and 80 million pounds, English, Premier League proven, his age, etc. The amount of time he's got left on his contract. Tchouaméni is probably £40 million player. I think he would be the one that I would probably go for. And again, if I was being greedy, I would just go and buy his midfield partner Monaco as well for Fana and just stick them in the pivot. But I think Tchouaméni has he's got it's difficult to say for certain that he would come in and be this sort of superstar, wonderful talent. I think you're right in saying that there are a lot of players who've come in with a sort of reputation or some sort of prediction that they're going to be some kind of transformative footballer. But I think he's probably more like a a Fofana or a Bissouma, guys that have come from League One and really hit the ground running. He looks to be more like that player. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think when you look at the better teams that Monaco have played, he's still one of the best players on the pitch, and particularly against PSG, I thought he was exceptional in both games that they played against them. I just think that he has that little bit of quality and class that I think you would want, as well as having all of the aggressive and defensive traits. So he would be the one that I'd like to go for. Who you pair him with, if Chelsea don't buy someone, is another question. But I think he gives you the flexibility because he can impact the game in every single third. And when I talk about multifunctional players, he can sit and defend. He can win, midfield battles in the middle of the pitch where it's congested. He can play the 1 and 2 touch stuff. He can create angles. He can do all of the technical stuff, and he can still create in the final third. He can score goals. So he is kind of a little bit of one of these players that can do kind of everything. And if Chelsea are going to sort of progress, I think as you're saying, progress the style of play, be a little bit more offensively minded, a bit more on the front foot, want to actually take the game to opponents. We need more players who are comfortable in all areas of the pitch, because it makes the game so much easier when you can rely on players in every single third. The big issue that we have, we're touching it just again very briefly here, is that nobody on midfield really is going to play a pass or score. And that kind of pretty much leaves the front three every single game. It has to be Mount, Havertz or Werner or whoever. Someone has to do something to create chances to win games, which is not always the best way that you, as you say, in terms of a sustainable attack over a Premier League season. You want to have more than kind of 3 people on the pitch that can probably affect the game. I think Tchouaméni gives you at least someone in that midfield pivot who can break forward, and then also you can get back in and defend as well. But yeah, somebody I'd really, really like personally, and hopefully, as you say, somebody that Chelsea are, there were kind of sort of tentative links around January that we were looking at him. So I do hope that is something that is true going forward.